Moral Development, Chapter 13. What is moral development? Well, it's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors regarding standards of what is right and wrong. There's intrapersonal and interpersonal dimensions. Intra is within yourself. Interpersonal is between you and someone else. The intrapersonal dimension regulates your activities when you're not engaged in social interactions. In other words, it's how you know what's right and wrong when nobody else is watching you. The interpersonal dimension regulates your social interactions and helps arbitrate conflict. I'm going to skip some things within the chapter. Piaget had theories of moral development. Kohlberg, make sure you read over those. Kohlberg believed that there were 6 different stages, 3 levels, 6 stages, the pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. Make sure you read over those. So I'm not going to go into those in detail in this recording. What I did want to spend most of the time talking about was parental relations, discipline, what we do as parents, as teachers, as human service workers, what we do, how that impacts children. So let's first talk about parental discipline. We can characterize discipline techniques into 3 basic categories: love withdrawal, power assertion, and induction. And I want to go over those. So love withdrawal is when the parent withholds attention or love from the child. So the parent refuses to talk to the child or states dislike for the child. For example, the parent might say, "I'm going to leave you if you do that again," or "I don't like when you do that." I have heard this over and over and over. For everything from parents giving children the silent treatment, which I would argue is not productive, to things like parents saying, "I don't like when you do that," which I would argue, is not, I think that's okay. If I was going to put a judgment on that. So 2 ends of the extreme. One being, giving a child the silent treatment for days on end, certainly not what we want to do, to letting a child know that "I don't like what you do when you do that." So that would be considered love withdrawal. Power assertion is the discipline technique when the parent attempts to gain control over the child or the child's resources. In my case, it is the removal of the DS, or removing something that my children like to do. It can include spanking, threatening, removing privileges, anything that you assert your power. This is my house, and if you don't follow the rules, then this is what's going to happen. So power assertion is discipline technique when the parent gains control over the child by somehow removing the child's resources or otherwise saying, "I'm the boss here, and if you don't do what I say, then this is the consequence that's going to happen." Induction, which I'll tell you right out, has been shown to be good for moral development, is when the parent uses reasoning and explains consequences for so for example, an induction could include, "Don't hit him, he was only trying to help you," or "Why are you yelling at her? She didn't mean to trip you." So what the parent is doing is they're explaining what the consequence or how the other person may feel, or they're putting some context in the situation. This has been shown to help with moral development. What we want to do is we want to increase empathy. We want for children to be able to see the other child's point of view. What I would caution you against is using this all the time. I mean, it sounds really nice. It sounds really wonderful. But I'll tell you, I wouldn't suggest doing this with a 3-year-old all the time. It has its place and it has its time. But as somebody who's worked with, hundreds of kids and parents, always saying things like this, it's not effective as far as wanting to have change. So I'm trying to be, careful, because your book really pushes, the induction method, and I do believe that it helps with moral development. But I also think that, carefully using some of the other methods also, a good mix would probably be, most effective. Before I go any further, I'll tell you that probably the best thing to do is to have what I call, just a positive environment. Um, so if you have an environment that it's least likely for the child to get in trouble, that's the ideal situation. So if you have a 2-year-old who loves to, pick up things, which 2-year-olds do, then I would try to have an environment that it's okay for them to pick up things versus having in the environment, really expensive stereo equipment that every time they pick it up, you have to yell at them. In fact, I was at a home visit just the other day, and oh gosh, it was probably a 13, 14-month-old, and they kept picking up things that the mom didn't want them to pick up. And mom kept yelling at them over and over and over and over. But the 13-month-old, 14-month-old, that's their nature. They were picking up things and putting it in their mouth. And, to have, a real successful environment, my suggestion would be to remove things that you don't want the baby to put in his mouth. And then, have things there that were okay. And I know that might seem like common sense. But when you're in the moment and when you're in the situation, sometimes things like that aren't common sense. So, to have an environment, a successful environment would be the first strategy. So if you have a hard time with your child because they don't pay attention to you while they're watching TV, well, then I wouldn't have the TV. And there certainly is going to be an adjustment period. I understand that. I'm a mom. But certain things or certain changes that you can make that would have the environment be successful to avoid a lot of the discipline problems that can arise. So children who are moral tend to have parents who are warm, supportive, use in the inductive discipline, provide opportunities to learning others' perspectives and feelings, involve the children in family decision making. More and more schools, especially elementary and junior high schools, are talking about moral development. One of the things, in addition to bullying's a really hot topic right now, but also moral development. Some of the things that you may see, that have to do with moral development, academic cheating. So we can see plagiarism, use of cheat sheets, copying from a neighbor during a test, purchasing papers, falsifying lab results. These things have been going on, not only since when I was in school, but since my grandparents were in school. It's just the forms have gotten a little bit more sophisticated, certainly since the use of the internet. So talking about, how important it is to use your own words and to study yourself and to not use somebody else's material, those are things that schools talk about now. A couple reasons why students cheat. Certainly there's pressure to get higher grades. There's time pressures. My goodness, everyone is so incredibly busy. Poor teaching. There have been studies that say that students are more likely to cheat when they perceive their teacher is incompetent, unfair, or uncaring. If a student believes that their teacher, really cares about them and is really trying to teach them, they have a certain amount of respect for their teacher. And that, if you respect the person, you're less likely to cheat. Lack of interest. If you're not interested in the subject, you're more likely to cheat. I want to switch over to some behavior disorders. We're kind of moving through the topics a little bit quickly here. I want to switch over to the behavior disorders, the first being conduct disorder. Conduct disorder is actually a disorder that's found in the DSM. If you remember from general psych, or if you've had abnormal psychology, the DSM is a book that we use to diagnose individuals with psychiatric or mental health disorders. What this disorder is the child has age-inappropriate actions and attitudes that violate family expectations. So what we do is we take a child, let's say we have a 10-year-old, and we take a look at what the family, the culture, the neighborhood, what would we expect of that child? And then is that child, performing or acting out? Are they doing things that are unacceptable in that area? Things could be, talking back to adults, having delinquent behaviors. Let's say they were, throwing rocks through windows, maybe yelling at their teachers, maybe, bullying other kids. But we also have to take a look at, what's accepted within that area. So, for example, my daughter goes to, a small country school, and, it's very, very low crime right now where I am. So if somebody threw a stone through a window somewhere, that would be a huge deal. But let's say it was, suddenly Mannheim, where I live, became a hot spot for crime and everybody was doing that. Well, I wouldn't diagnose everybody with conduct disorder. We need to take a look at the culture and the context. So anyhow, we have conduct disorder. Conduct disorder is required in order to diagnose somebody with antisocial disorder. So I'll get into that in just a moment. But we have conduct disorder. One of the telltale signs of conduct disorder is the children have a difficult time accepting direction, accepting authority figures. They have a hard time not only with their parents, because a lot of kids have difficult relationships with their parents, but it's also with the teachers. It's in multiple contexts. So to get this diagnosis, it wouldn't just be with mom or with dad. It would also be with the teachers, maybe in church, maybe in with the baseball coach, in multiple places we would see difficulty getting along. We would see them damaging the personal property or doing things that harm other people, multiple contexts. Juvenile delinquency refers to a broad range of behaviors, from socially unacceptable behaviors such as acting out in school, to status offenses such as running away, to criminal acts such as burglary. For legal purposes, the distinction is made between index offenses and status offenses. An index offense, these are criminal acts, whether they're committed by juveniles or adults, and they include acts such as robbery, aggravated assault, rape, homicide. So these are index offenses. Status offenses would include running away, truancy, underage drinking, sexual promiscuity. You think about status, the way I remember this is the status has to do with their age. So their current status is a minor, and these offenses relate to being a minor. You can't really run away as an adult. You don't have truancy issues once you're 17. There's not underage drinking once you're over 21. Sexual promiscuity is not illegal. It's not, I certainly wouldn't encourage it, but there's a difference between, when you're 13 and when you're, considered an adult. So we classify these as juvenile offenses, status offenses. Okay, if you remember just a few moments ago, I said antisocial behavior. Antisocial disorder is an actual disorder diagnosed in the DSM. Antisocial behavior would be, all these behaviors that are against society, things that are, harmful to others. Things that lead up to that are parents who are not monitoring their children, they're not supporting their children, they have ineffective discipline. If the child has an older sibling who has had negative behaviors, also living in a neighborhood that has high crime, high mobility. What I mean by high mobility is people are in and out. It's not a stable environment. These are predictors. It doesn't mean that everybody, but these are predictors of delinquency. The chapter then ends, after we've gone through delinquency, the chapter ends with religious and spiritual development. I'll let you go ahead and read through that. The gist of it is children typically end up adopting the religious beliefs of their parents. The book talks about, goes through this couple pages. If you have any questions, any comments, feel free to contact me. I would love to discuss any of this with you. Hope you enjoy the chapter, and keep reading.